The rain over Chicago was sharp that morning, the kind that made even the richest glass towers look like they were crying. Inside a modest apartment on South Side, Ava Johnson stood still in front of her mirror. The reflection staring back at her looked nothing like the girl who once graduated top of her class from the University of Illinois. Her eyes, once bright with ambition, now carried the weight of betrayal. 2 years ago, she was an analyst at Brightwell Capital, a promising face in a white world that applauded diversity only when it stayed quiet. But after refusing to take the blame for a failed deal her boss caused, she was branded unreliable and blacklisted overnight. Since then, no company would touch her resume, not even for an entry-level job. Bills piled up. Her mother's medical expenses grew. And one gray morning, scrolling through job boards, half asleep, Ava saw it. Personal assistant needed. King Global Holdings. Confidential position. Must be discreet and resilient. High compensation. Resilient, she murmured. I think I qualify for that. King Global was an empire tech logistics finance all built under the control of Alexander King, a man whose face rarely appeared in public, but whose power was felt in every boardroom from New York to Tokyo. Rumor said he didn't smile, didn't date, didn't trust anyone. And yet, Ava applied. A week later, she got a call. A driver would pick her up at 9:00 a.m. to bring her to the King Mansion, a vast estate on the north side of Chicago, overlooking Lake Michigan. She ironed her only white blouse, pressed her slacks, and whispered to her reflection, "You've faced worse, Ava. Today, just breathe." When she arrived, she was greeted by a man in a gray suit, the kind of butler you'd only see in movies. "Good morning, Ms. Johnson. I'm Mr. Whitaker, the household manager. Mr. King is expecting you." "Expecting me?" She blinked. "I thought this was for the assistant position." "Indeed. You'll be assisting Mr. King directly in his household matters." "Household," she repeated, her heart dropping. He handed her a uniform, a soft gray dress with an embroidered K on the collar. That's when she realized they thought she was applying to be a housekeeper. Ava could have walked out. But then she remembered the pile of hospital bills on her counter, the way her mother smiled weakly every time she pretended things were fine. So she forced a small laugh. "If it's a mistake, it's God's kind of mistake," she said softly, and she signed the contract. King Mansion was unlike anything she had ever seen. Marble floors gleamed like frozen light. Every wall carried art worth more than her old salary. The silence itself felt expensive. Mr. Whitaker guided her to a long corridor. "Mr. King dislikes noise, fragrance, or unnecessary questions. He works odd hours. You'll handle his meals schedule and personal environment. Understood? And one more thing." He paused, handing her a leather-bound booklet. "This is the King Manual. Read it, memorize it, follow it." The book was heavier than it looked, filled with notes on his diet temperature preferences, coffee measurements, and even the exact distance between his desk and window blinds. Ava exhaled, half amused. "The man doesn't want an assistant," she muttered. "He wants a psychic." That evening she met him for the first time. He was standing by the glass wall of his study, city lights flickering against his silhouette, tall, broad-shouldered, his shirt sleeves rolled up, a watch glinting like a blade. When he turned, Ava froze. Alexander King was every bit the legend she'd heard. Ice-blue eyes, a face that looked carved rather than born, and a voice so calm it demanded obedience. "You're the new one," he said without looking up from his laptop. "Yes, sir." "Ava Johnson." "Fine. Keep my coffee black. No sugar, no words. And don't rearrange anything on my desk." He returned to his screen, as if she ceased to exist. Ava bit back her irritation and went to work. But as she left the room, her gaze caught a photo on his desk, a woman smiling in a field of tulips. The frame was dusted untouched. For a second she wondered if behind the empire there was simply a lonely man who had forgotten how to live. Later that night in the mansion's quiet kitchen, Ava prepared coffee the way she always did. A touch of cinnamon, exactly 93 degrees just before the water begins to whisper. She didn't know that same cup would be the first thing to make Alexander King stop typing, mid-sentence, in months. "Who made this? I did, sir," she said, standing at the door. He looked up, and for the first time those cold eyes softened just slightly. "It's different. Different bad. Different good." She smiled. That night, while wiping the counter, Ava whispered to herself, "Even if the world mistook me for a housekeeper, I'll be the best damn one they've ever seen." Meanwhile, across town, the news flickered on an office screen. King Global offers $1 million reward for information on lost analyst Ava Johnson, the woman who predicted the Eurotech crash. Alexander's assistant glanced at the screen, confused. "Sir, still no leads on her." "Keep searching," Alexander replied without looking up. "She's not easy to find." Upstairs in the same mansion, Ava was folding his suit jacket, humming softly, completely unaware she was the woman he was offering $1 million to find. Sometimes life doesn't break us, it redirects us. And sometimes love begins not with fireworks, but with a quiet cup of coffee shared between two souls who've both forgotten how to hope. The morning sun poured through the glass walls of King Global's headquarters, a place where every reflection carried the weight of precision and every word could move millions of dollars. Inside the top-floor conference room, tension was thicker than the smell of polished mahogany. Alexander King, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, sat at the head of the long glass table, his expression as sharp as the lines of the skyline behind him. Around him, a dozen executives from Chicago to Dubai waited for the meeting to begin. The air was almost sacred. This was a $300 million deal, a partnership that could expand King Global into the Middle East. But from the first few minutes, something was wrong. The translator, a young man sweating through his collar, stumbled through Arabic phrases, twisting numbers, losing tone, confusing export with expense. Ava, who had come in quietly to serve coffee, stood at the edge of the room, invisible as most house staff usually were. But as she poured a cup, her brow furrowed. She could hear it clearly. The translation was all wrong. The man from Dubai, Mr. Al-Mansour, frowned as if insulted. His tone sharpened. "Is this how King Global values partnership?" Alexander's jaw tensed. What did he say? He demanded. The translator hesitated. He said, "The timeline is acceptable, sir." Ava's heart stopped. That wasn't what he said at all. She looked around the table. Nobody else spoke Arabic. No one realized the misunderstanding. And in that second, she made a choice, one that would change both of their lives. Ava stepped forward. Her voice was calm, but carried power. "Excuse me, sir," she said softly. "If I may." He didn't say that. The room froze. Every eye turned to the woman holding a tray. Even Alexander looked up, disbelief flickering across his face. He said, Ava continued in flawless Arabic, that the delay has already cost his company millions, and that he's questioning whether King Global can deliver on its promise. A silence followed, the kind that cuts through the air before a storm. Then in Arabic again, she turned to Mr. Al-Mansour with a graceful smile. "My employer apologizes for the misunderstanding. It was never his intention to appear dismissive. We deeply respect your partnership and your timeline." Her tone shifted, firm, diplomatic, precise. "If you allow us to revise the shipping route through Rotterdam instead of Marseille, The delivery will arrive 8 days earlier, saving approximately $2.4 million in transit. The room gasped. Even Alexander blinked as if hearing music after years of silence. When the translator tried to interject, Al-Mansur raised a hand. "Let the lady speak," he said, intrigued. "She understands the spirit of business." For the next 20 minutes, Ava guided the conversation, weaving between English and Arabic with the fluid grace of someone born for negotiations. She explained trade regulations, suggested flexible payment terms, even quoted a verse from Arabic poetry, something about honor and trust. By the time she finished, Al-Mansur was smiling. "You have wisdom beyond your years, Ms. Johnson," he said warmly. "King Global is lucky to have you." He signed the preliminary agreement, extending his hand to Alexander. "Consider our partnership renewed and our faith restored." When the delegates left, the room erupted in quiet chaos. Executives whispering, phones buzzing, the translator wiping sweat off his forehead. But Alexander sat still, watching Ava, as if he had never seen her before. Finally, he spoke. 6 languages, he murmured. Arabic, French, Mandarin, Spanish. And English, of course. "What's the 6th? Ava smiled faintly. "Italian. But I'm still learning idioms." He leaned back, studying her. "Who are you really?" "Ava Johnson." Her answer was simple. "Someone who once dreamed of working here before the world decided I didn't belong." For a long moment, neither spoke. The rain outside tapped against the windows, slow, deliberate, as if echoing their silence. Later that afternoon, in his private office, Alexander reviewed the meeting footage. Every sentence Ava translated, every expression, every pause. He noticed how she never flinched when spoken over, never raised her voice, yet somehow everyone listened when she spoke. For the first time in years, he smiled. When Mr. Whitaker, the butler, entered with a folder, Alexander's tone had softened. "Cancel the assistant search, sir. We already found her." That evening, as Ava was preparing dinner, she found a sealed envelope on the counter with her name. Inside was a short note written in Alexander's neat, controlled handwriting. "Effective immediately, you are assigned as my special assistant. Your duties to manage, translate, and tell me the truth, even when I don't want to hear it. A.K." Below it lay a small silver key engraved with the letter K. Ava ran her fingers over the metal. It was heavier than it looked. Not just a key to an office, she thought, but to something far more dangerous: trust. That night, as she stood by the kitchen window overlooking the lake, the city lights shimmered like a galaxy reflected on water. Somewhere across the house, she could hear Alexander's voice on a call, calm, steady, but different. Something in his tone had changed, and though neither of them said it out loud, they both knew that day's meeting had changed far more than a business contract. It had rewritten the balance between power and tenderness, between a man who thought he had everything and a woman who had nothing left to lose. In the stillness of that evening, Ava whispered to herself, "Maybe some destinies don't find us through love stories. They find us in boardrooms with coffee stains, hard choices, and a little courage to speak up." And upstairs, Alexander King, the man who once claimed not to believe in fate, sat in his office, turning the silver key between his fingers, unable to stop smiling. The winter came early that year in Chicago. Wind swept across the lake, carrying whispers of snow, and the great glass walls of King Mansion seemed to tremble under its cold breath. Inside, however, something subtle had begun to change. Since Ava Johnson became Alexander King's special assistant, the rhythm of the house softened. The once sterile rooms now carried the faint scent of chamomile and cinnamon. The grand piano in the corner no longer sat untouched. Sometimes in the evenings, a quiet melody drifted through the halls, notes uncertain, but sincere. And for the first time in years, the man who ruled empires had begun to sleep again. It started with tea. Ava had noticed the dark circles under Alexander's eyes, the restless pacing outside his study at 3 a.m., the untouched food trays left at his door. So one night, she brewed lavender Earl Grey, adding a slice of orange peel, something her grandmother used to make when the world felt too heavy. She knocked gently. "You should rest, Mr. King." "Can't," he murmured, still staring at his screen. "Numbers don't sleep. Neither do people with too many ghosts," she said quietly. He looked up a little startled. Ava placed the cup beside him, her fingers brushing the edge of his desk. "Just one sip. For science." He sighed, but drank. The taste was soft, unexpected. For a moment, the tension in his shoulders melted. "What's in this secret recipe?" She smiled. "One that's healed more hearts than spreadsheets ever could." From that night on, the tea became part of their unspoken ritual. He'd stay late working in silence, and she'd appear always with that cup, always with that calm presence that reminded him he wasn't entirely alone. Sometimes they spoke. Sometimes they didn't. But in the quiet moments, the soft hum of the heater, the distant sound of city traffic, something fragile began to grow. One night when a storm swept through the lakefront, lightning briefly illuminated the mansion's glass facade. Ava found him still at his desk, pale and exhausted. "You haven't eaten all day," she said. "Deadlines don't eat." "Neither do ghosts," she replied again, half teasing. But when he didn't respond, she noticed his hand trembling. His face turned white. Alexander. He tried to stand, but the world tilted. Papers scattered, his body swayed, then collapsed. Ava ran to him, catching his head before it hit the floor. "Alexander. Can you hear me?" No response. His breathing was shallow, labored. The doctor arrived within minutes, diagnosing sheer exhaustion, dehydration, overwork, no rest. After they left, Ava stayed. She couldn't bring herself to leave him alone in that vast, empty room. She placed a damp towel on his forehead, adjusted the blanket, and sat by his side as the snow fell outside. The only sound was the soft ticking of the clock. Hours passed. Then, in the dark, she heard him murmur a name, fragile, broken. "Emily." Ava froze. His hand clenched around the sheets, tears slipping from closed eyes. He whispered again, as if caught in a memory. "Emily, don't go. Please." And suddenly the pieces fit. The untouched photo on his desk, the silence around his personal life, the reason he built walls higher than his skyscrapers. Emily, the woman he had loved and lost, the fiancé who died in a car crash 5 years ago, the night before their wedding. Ava sat still, the ache in her chest almost unbearable. She brushed a strand of hair from his face and whispered more to the darkness than to him. "You don't have to forget her, Alexander. You only have to remember. You're still allowed to live." Her words trembled. "The world took something from you, but it didn't take your right to be loved again." For a moment, his body stilled. Then, in his sleep, his hand reached out, searching, fragile, human. Instinctively, Ava took it. His fingers closed around hers, warm and desperate. She stayed like that until dawn, her hand never moving, afraid the silence might shatter if she let go. When he woke, the morning light was pale, brushing gold against his skin. He blinked slowly, disoriented, then saw her asleep in the chair beside his bed, her hand still in his. Something shifted inside him. For years he had lived surrounded by people who wanted his power, his money, his name. Yet here was a woman who stayed simply because he needed rest. He studied her face, the quiet strength, the faint scar near her temple, the way her lips curved slightly even in sleep. He whispered almost to himself, "You stayed." Her eyes fluttered open. Of course. Someone had to make sure the empire doesn't collapse. He laughed softly, the first genuine laugh that had escaped him in years. "You're not afraid of me, are you? Should I be?" she asked. "Everyone else is. Then maybe they've never seen you as I do." Her voice was gentle but certain. Not as a CEO. Just a man trying to remember how to breathe. From that day, Alexander began to change in ways so small, no one outside the mansion would notice. But Ava did. He started eating breakfast. He began walking by the lake on Sundays, sometimes with 2 cups of coffee instead of 1. He read again poetry, of all things. And sometimes, when the world became too loud, he would seek the quiet of the kitchen, where Ava hummed while preparing tea. He never said thank you. But every look, every softened word carried the weight of gratitude that didn't need to be spoken. Weeks passed, and one night as the snow melted into spring rain, they stood together by the window overlooking the city. Ava broke the silence. "You know, for someone who doesn't believe in love, you're doing a terrible job convincing me." He smiled, the corners of his eyes creasing. "And for someone who claims to be a housekeeper, you're remarkably good at fixing people." Their laughter mingled with the rain outside, quiet, fleeting, real. And though neither said it aloud, both knew something had shifted forever. In that mansion, once ruled by silence, warmth had returned, carried not by grand gestures or vows, but by the simple act of 2 wounded hearts, daring once again to care. It began with small changes. The King Mansion, once a monument to silence, no longer felt like a museum of marble and memory. The air was softer now, alive with the faint scent of lavender tea, the quiet hum of music in the evenings, and the occasional sound of laughter that startled even the walls. Ava Johnson had been working beside Alexander King for weeks, long enough to learn his rhythms, the way he buried himself in work until dawn, how he kept a world of people close, yet none near, and how sleep was something he spoke of like a myth. She didn't try to fix him. She simply began to care. One evening she found him at his desk again, the only light in the room coming from his laptop screen. His tie was loosened, his eyes bloodshot. "You'll go blind before the next quarter ends," she said gently. He didn't look up. "Numbers don't wait, Ava." She placed a steaming cup beside him. "Neither does the body. Try this." He raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "Tea, chamomile, honey, and orange peel," she said. "It's the only kind that can trick stubborn men into sleeping." He exhaled, half a laugh, half surrender, and took a sip. The warmth spread through him, unfamiliar, but welcome. "You keep doing this," he murmured. "Doing what?" "Making the world quieter." From that night on, their routine shifted. He worked. She read reports nearby, helping him sort through chaos. Sometimes they didn't speak for hours, yet the silence between them was no longer cold. It was companionable, filled with small gestures. Her hand setting down another cup of tea, his glance softening when she entered the room. She showed him how to steep the tea himself, how to wait, how to be patient, how to notice. He pretended to scoff, but she caught him once, late at night, practicing alone in the kitchen, like a student, too proud to ask for praise. The mansion began to breathe again. The staff smiled more. The air felt warmer. Even the light seemed to linger longer in the hallways. And Alexander, the man whose name once struck fear in boardrooms, began to sleep. It was a stormy night when everything changed. The power flickered as rain lashed against the tall windows. Alexander had been in his study for nearly 20 hours straight, reviewing a contract that could make or break his company. Ava brought him dinner untouched as usual. "At least drink some water," she said softly. He waved her off, his voice low and hoarse. I can't. Not until it's perfect. She sighed. Perfection isn't the same as peace, Mr. King. He gave a tired smile. Peace is expensive. Moments later, his pen slipped from his hand. His body leaned forward. Before Ava could react, he collapsed onto the desk. Her heart lurched. Alexander. She ran to him, checking his pulse, faint but steady. The doctor arrived soon after, confirming exhaustion, dehydration, and stress. He needs rest. Real rest, the doctor said. When everyone left, Ava stayed. She couldn't bring herself to leave him alone in that vast, echoing house. She dimmed the lights, placed a wet cloth on his forehead, and sat by his bedside. The sound of rain against the glass was the only witness to her quiet vigil. Hours passed. His breathing steadied, and then he began to whisper. Emily. Ava froze. The name carried a pain so raw that even the storm seemed to pause. Emily. Don't leave. Tears slid from his closed eyes. His hand twitched, reaching for someone who wasn't there. Ava's chest tightened. She remembered the photograph on his desk, the smiling woman in the field of tulips, her eyes bright with life. Emily, the fiancée he had lost 5 years ago in a car crash. The reason behind the sleepless nights, the walls, the silence. Ava's voice trembled when she spoke, barely a whisper in the dark. You don't have to forget her, Alexander. Her hand brushed his hair gently. You just have to believe. You still deserve to love again. As if her words reached him through the dream, his fingers moved, searching, and found hers. She didn't pull away. Their hands remained clasped, his touch firm, kneading fragile. In that quiet, something shifted. Not love, not yet, but the first faint warmth of it. The kind that comes when pain finally meets understanding. He woke at dawn. Light streamed through the curtains, soft and golden. For a moment he looked disoriented, then saw her sitting in the armchair asleep, still holding his hand. He studied her face, the quiet strength, the patience, the gentleness that didn't demand to be seen, yet somehow filled the room. When she stirred, he spoke softly. You stayed. She smiled faintly. Someone had to make sure you didn't work yourself into the next life. He chuckled, a low, rare sound. I didn't think you were the kind to disobey orders. You should stop thinking I'm just the kind, Mr. King. For a second he said nothing. Then quietly, You're right. You never were. In the days that followed, the unspoken bond between them deepened. He asked her opinion on contracts, invited her to dinner, instead of dismissing her. After work, listened, truly listened when she spoke. She noticed the change, too, the way he looked out the window more often, the way he no longer rushed through silence as if afraid of it. Sometimes their eyes met across the room, and something tender flickered there, something neither dared to name. One evening, as spring began to melt, the last traces of snow, they found themselves standing by the window overlooking the lake. The air was calm, the world quiet. You ever think about destiny? She asked. Only when it laughs at me, he replied. Maybe it's not laughing, she said softly. Maybe it's just waiting for you to forgive it. He looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time the walls around his heart felt like they could finally crack. Outside, the wind carried the scent of rain. Inside, a man who'd forgotten how to feel stood beside a woman who taught him that peace didn't always come from silence. Sometimes it came from being seen. And somewhere in that stillness, love began, quiet, hesitant, real. The celebration glittered through the glass towers of downtown Chicago, champagne bubbling, laughter echoing, music weaving through the hum of victory. King Global had just secured one of the largest international contracts in its history, a triumph that would be written in business magazines and remembered for years. But for Alexander King, the success felt strangely hollow. He stood by the balcony drink untouched, watching rain slide down the city lights. The crowd inside executives, investors, foreign partners cheered his name. Yet his gaze kept drifting toward the woman standing quietly by the bar. Ava Johnson. Her black evening dress shimmered like midnight silk, elegant yet unpretentious. Her hair framed her face softly, and though she smiled when spoken to, her eyes seemed somewhere else, somewhere far lonelier than the room allowed. When their eyes met, the noise around them dimmed. Hours later, after the guests had left and the lights dimmed low, the mansion returned to silence. Ava stayed behind to organize the last of the papers and contracts scattered on the table. Her heels clicked faintly on the marble floor, the sound of a woman holding herself together. Alexander appeared in the doorway, jacket over his arm tie undone. His usual composure had cracked just enough for fatigue to slip through. "Still working. Someone has to clean up after the celebration," she said lightly. He smiled faintly. "You're more diligent than the board of directors." "They get paid more," she replied, not looking up. He walked closer, poured 2 glasses of wine and handed her one. She hesitated. "I don't usually drink," she murmured. "Tonight's different," he said quietly. "You saved this deal. You deserve a toast." She took the glass. Their fingers brushed and stayed for a moment too long. The first sip burned gently down her throat. Then another, and another. The room softened around the edges, laughter slipping easier, now walls falling quietly between them. They talked, really talked for the first time without titles, without the weight of responsibility pressing against their words. He told her about his late fiancée, Emily, and how guilt had become his only companion since that night. She spoke of the world that had rejected her, the corporate betrayal, the doors closed to women who didn't fit the mold. "You rebuilt me," he said at one point, voice low. "You made this house feel alive again, and you made me believe hard work could still mean something." She whispered. For a while they just sat there, 2 souls bound by fatigue and unspoken gratitude. Then Ava set down her glass, eyes glassy and tender. "I shouldn't say this," she murmured, "but if I don't, I'll regret it." Alexander's gaze met hers, searching. "Say what?" She swallowed, tears glinting at the corners of her eyes. "I love you, Alexander." Her voice trembled. "But I know you'll never see me as more than a woman who brings your tea and arranges your files." The room went utterly still. He stared at her, not as a CEO, not as a man in control, but as someone stripped bare. "Ava." She shook her head, the words tumbling out through tears. "It's all right. I just needed you to know. For me, not for you." She stood to leave, but he caught her wrist. "You think I don't see you?" he said, voice rough with something deeper than pain. "You think I haven't tried not to?" Their eyes met, 2 storms colliding. He stepped closer, his breath uneven. "You walk into every room like you belong there, even when the world tells you otherwise. You're the only person who's ever told me no, and meant it." She didn't move, afraid even a breath would shatter the moment. Then his voice broke softer than she'd ever heard it. "You're not invisible, Ava. You never were." He reached up, brushed a tear from her cheek, and something inside both of them gave way. Their lips met, not out of desire, but out of exhaustion and truth. It wasn't passion that drove them, but the unbearable need to be understood, to feel human, if only for a night. The storm outside raged, wind howling against the mansion's walls. Inside, the fire burned low as they fell together, every barrier, dissolving fear, grief, guilt, until nothing remained but warmth. It wasn't reckless. It wasn't wild. It was heartbreak finding shelter. When he kissed her forehead afterward, neither spoke. The world for once was still. At dawn, sunlight spilled across the sheets, pale and honest. Alexander reached beside him, but the bed was empty. On the pillow lay a folded note in Ava's neat handwriting. "Mr. King, thank you for letting me feel seen, even if only for a moment. But I can't stay where my heart will always belong to someone who can't return it. Please consider this my resignation." Ava Johnson, beside it, lay her employee badge and a single pressed tulip petal, the same kind from the photograph on his desk. He sat there for a long time, staring at the letter, until the ink blurred through his tears. Days turned into weeks. He searched everywhere, called contacts, questioned, staff, traced every lead. When his private investigator returned with a folder, Alexander tore it open with trembling hands. Inside was a copy of an old report, a list of names from a once-collapsed investment firm. And there, in bold letters, A.V.A. Johnson, former financial analyst, Brightwell Capital. Underneath, a note from years ago, written by his own HR department, status blacklisted, involved in exposing executive-level fraud. Alexander's breath caught. He looked again at the date, the signature. And then, in shock, he saw the name she had signed in her resignation letter, not just Ava Johnson, but Ava M. Johnson. It was the same name on a file he had kept hidden for years. The woman the industry once called the Brightwell prodigy, the one whose economic model had predicted the Eurotech collapse and saved dozens of investors, was the very same woman who had been folding his shirts, making his tea, and quietly rebuilding his soul. Alexander sat in silence, the truth hitting like thunder. The woman he had been searching for across continents was the same one who had just walked out of his life. And for the first time in his empire-built life, Alexander King realized that all the power in the world couldn't buy back what he had just lost. Winter had melted into spring when Ava Johnson disappeared from Chicago. No one at King Global dared to mention her name, but her absence hung in the air, like perfume lingering long after the person has left the room. For Alexander King, the mansion returned to what it had once been, silent, immaculate, and unbearably empty. He buried himself in work, in travel, in anything that could dull the ache of losing her. But every corner of the house, the faint scent of lavender tea, the books left dog-eared on his desk, reminded him that someone had once made this place human. And he couldn't stop wondering why she'd left. Ava, meanwhile, had chosen not to look back. She moved to a quiet neighborhood on the south side, trading marble floors for cracked sidewalks and laughter-filled classrooms. With the small savings she had and a modest grant she earned through an essay competition, she opened the New Dawn Foundation, a humble center that offered free education and skill training for women and children struggling to rebuild their lives. Her first students were 3 single mothers and a teenage girl who couldn't afford college. By the end of the month, there were 30. Each evening, as she swept the floors of her tiny office, Ava whispered to herself, "You don't need a title to make a difference." But at night, when the world went quiet, her hand would still drift to the empty side of the bed, to the memory of a man who had looked at her once, as if she were the only thing left worth believing in. Across the city, Alexander was losing sleep again. He had sent flowers, messages, letters, all unanswered. His calls went straight to voicemail. He even visited her old apartment only to find the place empty, the walls stripped bare. Mr. Whitaker, his loyal house manager, once tried to console him. "Perhaps she needed space, sir. Sometimes love needs distance to breathe." Love doesn't disappear without a word, Alexander said quietly. No, Whitaker replied, but pain does make people silent. Then came the storm within his own family. When Alexander finally mentioned Ava's name at a family dinner, his mother's hand froze around her wine glass. Margaret King was the kind of woman who carried tradition like armor, elegant, poised, and merciless when her family's reputation was at stake. "You're speaking of that woman again?" she asked sharply. "Her name is Ava," he said evenly. "Ava Johnson," she repeated, tasting the name as if it were bitter. The housekeeper. She was never just that. Alexander, her voice hardened. "You are a king. You cannot bring a servant into this family. What would people say?" He leaned back, eyes cold. "They'd say, I found someone who reminds me what humanity looks like." But she had already turned away, her tone clipped and final. "I won't allow it." Margaret moved quickly, as women of power often did. She had the resources, private investigators, lawyers, quiet influence in the press. She found Ava's new address within weeks. And one morning, Ava opened the door of her foundation to find Mrs. King standing there, immaculate in pearls and disdain. "Mrs. King," Ava said, trying to steady her voice. "This is a place for students, not battles. Then I suggest you listen carefully," Margaret said, stepping inside. "You've had your moment. My son may be blind, but I am not. You think I'd let a woman like you destroy his name?" Ava folded her arms. "A woman like me, a housemaid, a distraction. Whatever you call yourself." "I call myself someone who loved him," Ava said quietly, "and who never asked for a single thing in return." Margaret's gaze narrowed. "Then prove it. Leave him, for good. Whatever attachment remains between you two will only ruin his future and yours." Ava's voice trembled, but her eyes didn't. "I already left him once. You didn't need to tell me how." She turned to walk away, but Margaret's voice followed like a knife. "You're with child, aren't you?" Ava froze. Margaret's tone softened, deceptively so. "I know. My people found the clinic appointment you canceled. I'm giving you an opportunity to correct this mistake before it becomes permanent." That night, Ava sat alone in her small apartment, hand resting on her stomach. She had suspected for weeks, but hearing it aloud had made it real. The child, his child, was growing inside her. Tears slid down her cheeks, not from fear, but from the impossible mixture of grief and grace. She whispered into the quiet little one, "You were never a mistake." When Margaret King returned, days later, with a signed check and an envelope of legal documents, Ava met her at the door with calm defiance. "I don't want your money," she said. "Then what do you want?" "Nothing that belongs to your family," Ava replied. "I only want this child to bear my name. Johnson." For a brief moment, Margaret's expression flickered, perhaps guilt, perhaps disbelief, before her mask returned. "You're making a terrible choice." "No," Ava said softly. "I'm making the right one." And with that, she closed the door. Months passed. Ava poured her heart into New Dawn Foundation, her belly growing, her strength unwavering. She worked through morning sickness, through exhaustion, through loneliness. Her students adored her, not for her past, but for the way she believed in their future. She never once reached out to Alexander, though every heartbeat reminded her of him. Alexander didn't learn the truth until half a year later. It happened by chance, an overheard conversation at a charity gala. Someone mentioned a new foundation on the South Side run by a brilliant woman named Johnson, pregnant but unstoppable. He left the event immediately. By the time he arrived at New Dawn, the building was empty. The staff told him gently that Ms. Johnson had left for another city, to open a second branch. No forwarding address, no message, only a single plaque by the door, New Dawn Foundation, for every woman who was told she wasn't enough. Alexander stood there for a long time, rain soaking through his coat. Somewhere out there, the woman he loved was building a world without him and carrying a child he didn't even know existed. And for the first time in his life, Alexander King, the man who could control markets and silence governments, realized there was one thing he could never command: a woman's quiet, unyielding choice to walk away with her dignity intact. 5 years had passed since Ava Johnson walked away from Chicago. 5 years since she chose silence over scandal, dignity over dependence, and a life that belonged only to her. The world had changed in those years. So had she. Now she was no longer the woman who once folded suits in marble halls. She was Ava Johnson, founder of the New Dawn Foundation, an organization known nationwide for helping underprivileged women and children rebuild their futures through education and job training. On the morning of the Global Investment and Philanthropy Summit in New York, the stage lights glowed against the banner bearing her foundation's name. Ava stood behind the podium, her poise serene, her presence commanding. She wore a soft cream suit, minimal jewelry, and a quiet confidence that didn't need to prove itself anymore. As the cameras flashed, she glanced down at the first row, where a small girl sat with a sketchbook in her lap, drawing flowers in colored pencil. Lily, her daughter, 5 years old. Bright, curious, with curls like her mother's, and eyes the color of summer storms, clear blue, unmistakably familiar. While Ava's voice carried through the hall, warm, steady, persuasive Alexander King sat among the audience, frozen. He had not expected to see her again. When he read her name in the summit brochure, he thought it had to be coincidence, someone else, perhaps another Johnson. But the moment she stepped onto that stage, the air left his lungs. It was her. The woman who had haunted every quiet night, whose laughter still lived somewhere in the walls of his empty mansion. And standing before him now, she was radiant, a woman who had not only survived, but flourished. He leaned forward, unable to look away. The New Dawn Foundation, she was saying, believes that opportunity is the only inheritance every child deserves. We are not rescuing lives. We are rebuilding futures. The room erupted in applause. But Alexander couldn't hear any of it. His gaze was fixed on the little girl, who now clapped her small hands proudly, calling out, "Mommy, Mommy, you did it." Ava smiled down at her, and in that single moment, something inside Alexander shattered. The girl's voice, her eyes, those blue eyes, his eyes. When the event ended, the crowd surged toward Ava, investors and reporters vying for her attention. Alexander waited by the side entrance, hands clenched, unsure whether to breathe or walk away. Then she appeared calm amid the chaos, holding Lily's hand. She saw him instantly. For a heartbeat, her steps faltered. Then, as though 5 years had been nothing more than 5 seconds, their eyes met, the silence between them thick with everything unsaid. Lily tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mommy, who's that man?" Ava hesitated. "Just someone I used to know." Alexander's voice broke the air. "Ava." Her name spoken like a confession. They met again later in a quiet garden behind the conference hall, far from cameras, far from the polished world that had never been kind to either of them. The city hummed beyond the hedges. Between them stood years of silence and a child with curious eyes tracing butterflies on her palm. He took a slow breath. "I looked for you everywhere." Ava didn't respond. Her gaze remained on Lily, who was now chasing sunlight. You built all this? He continued softly, motioning toward the building behind them. The foundation, the school programs. You did it on your own. There was no other way, she said. No one was waiting to rescue me. He swallowed hard. Why didn't you tell me? That made her turn. Her voice, though quiet, carried the force of every heartbreak she'd endured. Tell you. You think it would have mattered. It would have changed everything. For who, Alexander? For you or for me? He looked away, guilt flickering across his face. Lily returned, holding a small flower she had picked. Mommy, look. It's blue like my eyes. Ava smiled and tucked the flower behind her daughter's ear. Alexander's breath caught at the sight. The resemblance was undeniable, not just the color of her eyes, but the small gestures, the tilt of her head, the quiet focus that mirrored his own. He stepped closer, his voice barely a whisper. That little girl. She's mine, isn't she? Ava didn't flinch. Her tone was calm, almost tender. You once said I was just a housekeeper, remember? She met his gaze. Then yes, she's the daughter of a housekeeper. The words landed like a blade wrapped in silk. Not cruel, just true. He closed his eyes for a moment, his throat tightening. I never meant those words. But you said them, she replied. And I lived them, every single day since. The air between them grew heavy, the kind of silence that carried years of what-ifs. Does she know about me? He asked finally. She knows her father was kind once, Ava said softly. That's enough for now. Ava. Please no, Alexander. She interrupted gently. I don't hate you. I just learned how to live without you. Her voice trembled, but her eyes held steady. You had your empire. I had to build mine brick by brick, while carrying the part of you that couldn't stay. For a while, neither spoke. Lily ran ahead toward the fountain, her laughter carrying through the courtyard like sunlight through rain. Alexander followed Ava's gaze toward her. She's beautiful. She's strong, Ava corrected softly. Like every child who grows up knowing love doesn't always come the easy way. He nodded, defeated, but in awe. You've built something extraordinary, he said finally. So have you, she answered. You just didn't notice it walking away. As they parted, Lily ran up and offered him the flower from her hair. For you, she said with a shy smile. Alexander crouched to her level, accepting it as though it were the most precious thing he'd ever held. Thank you, Lily, he said softly. Ava froze. How do you know her name? He smiled faintly, eyes glistening. Because 5 years ago, I dreamed of a little girl with your smile, and her name was Lily. For the first time in years, Ava's composure cracked. And as she turned to lead her daughter away, Alexander stood in the fading light, a man who had conquered everything except the distance between his heart and the woman who had once called him home. 1 year had passed since that fateful reunion in New York. In that time, something remarkable happened, not overnight, not through apologies or grand gestures, but through slow, deliberate acts of trust. King Global and the New Dawn Foundation began to work together. What started as tentative collaboration turned into a shared mission, empowering women to rise from limitation to leadership. Ava and Alexander spoke often at meetings, on calls, in long discussions that stretched into the quiet hours. At first, it was all business. Then somewhere between the emails and the late-night coffee, a fragile kind of forgiveness began to bloom. It wasn't about rekindling what was lost. It was about discovering what had survived. Now, a year later, the grand ballroom of the Fairmont Chicago gleamed beneath crystal chandeliers. Reporters filled the aisles, cameras lined the back, and a massive banner stretched across the stage. King Global and New Dawn Partnership, $1 billion, initiative to empower women entrepreneurs. It was more than a contract. It was history. Ava stood near the stage, dressed in an elegant navy gown, her hair pinned neatly, her expression calm, but her heart trembling. Across the room, Alexander was finishing an interview, surrounded by flashes and microphones. He looked older, perhaps wiser, softer, but when he caught sight of her, his eyes lit with the same quiet reverence as that first day she brought him coffee. And beside Ava, little Lily clutched a small bouquet of white tulips, her mother's favorite. The speeches began. Executives spoke of progress, innovation, philanthropy, all the words that sound powerful in press releases, but fall short of the real story. Then Alexander took the stage. He didn't read from the teleprompter. Instead, he paused, looked out at the audience, and said softly, "This partnership isn't just about money or business. It's about redemption, about what happens when we choose to believe in second chances." His voice steadied, but his gaze never left Ava. 5 years ago, I lost someone who taught me that compassion is stronger than ambition, that love isn't weakness. It's the only thing that gives strength a purpose. Tonight, I stand not as a CEO, but as a man who was lucky enough to be taught what humanity means by the woman I hurt the most. The room went utterly still. Ava's breath caught. Reporters leaned forward, pens frozen midair. Alexander reached into his jacket pocket. "Before we sign the official $1 billion contract," he said, "I have another document that needs to be signed first." He unfolded a cream-colored paper and handed it to the MC, who projected it onto the massive LED screen behind him. The crowd gasped. It wasn't a legal contract. It was handwritten, simple yet profound. Contract of life. King and Johnson Partnership. Term forever. Value priceless. Position is king. For a moment, no one moved. Then murmurs rippled through the audience. Soft laughter, tears, applause. Alexander turned toward Ava, his eyes glistening, his voice low and trembling now. "Ava Johnson, 5 years ago you walked into my life as a housekeeper. But what you really did was rebuild a man who'd forgotten how to live. You gave me back my faith. You gave the world your kindness. And you gave me a daughter whose eyes remind me every day that miracles are real." He took a deep breath, then did something no one expected. He knelt. The powerful billionaire, the man once too proud to admit weakness, dropped to one knee under the golden lights of the ballroom. Gasps filled the room. Lily clapped her tiny hands, eyes shining. "Mommy, Daddy's signing the contract." The audience laughed through tears as Alexander held out a small velvet box. Inside the ring gleamed simple, elegant, just like the woman he loved. "Ava Johnson," he said, his voice breaking slightly, "the woman who began as my housekeeper and became the keeper of my heart. Will you marry me?" Ava's lips trembled. The years of distance, the pain, the misunderstanding, all of it flooded through her like a wave she had waited too long to face. She looked at him, not the billionaire, not the legend, but the man who had finally learned what love meant: humility, forgiveness, faith. Tears fell freely down her cheeks as she whispered, "Yes, Alexander, 1,000 times yes." The room erupted. Applause thundered through the hall, flashes exploded like starlight, and somewhere between the cheers, little Lily threw her arms around both of them. "Does this mean I get to be a king too?" she squealed. Alexander laughed, pulling her close. "You've always been one, sweetheart." That night, beneath a rain of confetti and light, Ava and Alexander stood hand in hand as the crowd rose to their feet. Behind them, the screen glowed with the words, New Dawn ex-King Global. But everyone in the room knew this wasn't just about business. It was about two people who had fought through pride loss and judgment to find their way back not to perfection, but to peace. As the orchestra played softly, Ava leaned toward him and whispered, "It seems we both signed the better contract." He smiled. The only one that ever mattered. Some stories remind us that love doesn't erase the past, it redeems it. And sometimes the greatest victories aren't the ones written in billion-dollar deals, but in quiet promises between two people who finally choose to stay. If you believe in second chances, let love sign its name on your heart too.